Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome to an honorable mention from the best games period. As you may have seen earlier, I guess now last week, we did have a full episode on the timeless classic Lair about sky flying dragons. It was pretty good. Go give that a listen, but just out of the greatness of our hearts, and definitely not because of any April-related shenanigans, we're putting out another little something for you fine people to listen to. And that's going to be what I'm going to be talking about this week. I should start out by saying that I have two disclaimers for this episode. One, I'm going to be talking about a game that is shockingly explicit. Maybe not shockingly explicit, but shockingly explicit in the context of an 8-bit video game. And I say that just because when I talk about it, usually I recommend that people, go out and play whatever we're covering on the show. But if you do that, just be prepared that it's going to be, it's going to involve some, shall we say, harsh language. My second disclaimer is that I will probably be mispronouncing both the name of the game and some other words and phrases throughout this episode, because this week I'm going to be talking about a game that is called Increpare. I probably butchered that, but that's what it's called, and obviously you'll see it in the name of the episode this week, but it's an Irish phrase that means good night. It's a very hard game to talk about because, well, before I talk about the game itself, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history around the game. So, Increpare is a collaboration between developers Terry Cavanagh, who you might recognize from, he's the developer behind games like VVVVV and Super Hexagon. Those are kind of his two biggest games, though he's worked on a large number of other games besides that. It's fair to say that he's prolific. And Increpare is a collaboration between him, Terry Cavanagh, and this other gentleman in the UK. They're both based in the UK, named Stephen Levelle. Online he goes by Increpare. Increpare? I'm not really sure how to pronounce that word. Again, I refer you back to my second disclaimer, where I said that I was going to be mispronouncing a lot of things this episode, because I don't speak Gaelic, and I also can't speak old-timey, at least as far as the internet tells me, old-timey legal phrases for attack. Anyway, Stephen Levelle is also a very prolific developer in his own right. In fact, if you go to his website, he actually has 255 games that he has developed and put out. He usually puts them out for free, so you can actually go to his website, increpare.com, I believe, and you can play like everything he's ever made, and it's pretty. I would suggest you at least check it out. I mean, 255 games is a lot to kind of chew on, but they're very interesting. They're not for everyone. I'll just put it like that. They're the kind of games that not everyone can really get into, but they all have a point. They're all interesting, and you get the impression when you're playing them that they're made by someone who's very much smarter than you are, which is kind of backed up by the fact that the few games he's put out that aren't freeware games are these incredibly challenging puzzle games, and that are just kind of mind-bending. And if you don't know what I'm really talking about, look up a game called English Country Tune, and that is a puzzle game that is completely bonkers and difficult, and I don't think anyone really knows why it's called English Country Tune, because as far as I can tell, it doesn't have much to do with English country tunes. But all that being said, these two people came together and developed what I would basically call, and what others have called on the internet, a short story game. If you remember, a number of episodes ago, we talked about a game called Passage, and we talked about why that was important and interesting, and Ikewa is kind of along the same lines as Passage. It's not a terribly long game. It is longer than Passage, which you can complete Passage in about 5 minutes. Ikewa, probably about 15 to 20 minutes long, so a little bit longer. Not a huge... it's not going to take up a huge amount of your time. However, the reason I wanted to talk about it this week is it's just one of those games that really challenges what your idea of a game is. Like, what a game can be, what a game can do. And it does that in very simple terms. And again, this came up when we were talking about Passage. You know, what can a game be? What are the limits of gameness? I think Ikewa kind of takes it a step further and gets more where Passage is abstract and more open to interpretation. It's a game that's supposed to encapsulate an entire lifetime of experience in abstract 8-bit art. Ikewa is targeted and concrete into this one situation, and it's not and it's a situation that is filled up. Like, a lot of times games kind of leave things open to interpretation because they're hoping the player is going to fill in the game with their own experiences, with their own life and perspective. Whereas Ikewa doesn't do that. You are taking on a very specific role in the game. And I would highly encourage people to go and play it. I'll have a link in the description of the episode so you can find it. It's free. It's and there are a number of places you can find it that are probably seedier, because it is a Flash game, so it's carried on a number of different websites. I would suggest finding it on Increpare.com. That's the site it's originally hosted on, if you, for whatever reason, don't want to go to the link in the episode description. So this came out in 2011, by the way, so it's several years old at this point, and I'm just telling you to go out and play it in case you don't want it spoiled for you. But I will say that even if it is spoiled for you, even if you know what's coming, this is the kind of game that it doesn't matter. It's still very much a gut punch of a game, and will probably tear you up, because I've played it several times. It's like a knife in the heart, and it gives a little twist every time you play it. And so what is it? What is Ikewa? Basically, it's about a little girl named Emer who lives with her parents. Her parents are incredibly abusive. So the game starts out, and it's basically your mother calling you inside, or Emer's mother calling her inside to, you know, get ready for dinner. And this very first interaction sets the tone for the game, and the mother just berates Emer over and over until she gets tired and goes inside. One of the very first things you'll notice about Ikewa is it's very familiar 8-bit aesthetic, but the colors are all very purposefully chosen to make you uncomfortable and nervous. It looks kind of sickening. Like, visually, your brain is already telling you something isn't right here. There's some kind of sickness here. And that's kind of reinforced by the music, which is also kind of the same way. It's purposefully keeping you off balance as a player. So you have these two things going on, and you immediately start off on that downer of a note, getting yelled at by your mother. And this is one of the things why I had the first disclaimer at the beginning of the episode because they curse a lot. Like, there's a lot of cursing in this game, and it's directed at a child, which understandably, there are a lot of people who aren't comfortable with that. And if you're looking for a comfortable game, Ikewa is not it. It's very much uncomfortable. So, Emer goes inside. You can explore the house. This is a very linear game. This isn't a game where your player decisions are going to get you vastly different outcomes or get a secret ending or anything like that. So Emer eventually goes and talks to her mom, and her mom's like, go feed your brother's dog. You're like, okay. And you go and feed the dog. And at a minimum, you're going into the house, and then you're going into the kitchen. And that's two scene transitions. One of the things you'll notice in the transitions is that each time you enter a new space, there is a deep, unnerving sound effect. And that's the first taste you're going to have that, even more so than the music and the visuals, the sound effects are going to play a huge role in how unnerved and uncomfortable things are. Because it's this deep, booming transition noise. Almost like it's the end of a scene. You're transitioning into a different part of the story itself and going deeper into this mad little world. And you get into the house, and it's just, the hallways are black, the walls are just this kind of creepy white grayish gradient. The kitchen is kind of this sickly green color. Then you go and feed the dog, and when you interact with the dog just whines very sadly, and the Emer is just like, oh, Buttercup, you're always so sad. You like being sad, don't you, Buttercup? And then the dog eats the dinner, and it's like this slurping, kind of grotesque eating noise. And then you go back to the kitchen, and your mother tells you to make your bed because you're sloppy. I'm not going to be fully on board with all the words she's using, but she tells you you're messy, and your room is messy. Or she tells Emer that her room is messy and sloppy, and to go clean it up. Of course, imagine that when I'm saying anything that her parents are saying, there is more cursing and colorful language that is not fun and makes you want to cry. And so Emer goes to her room, and the only thing in her room, there's a bed, and then there's a little doll next to her bed. And when you make the bed, she turns to the doll and says the same words her parents are saying to her. And then you can leave and you go back to the kitchen. And the mother then tells Emer to set the table. And so you set the table. And so you have Emer set the table. Except immediately the mother notices that Emer didn't set the table right. The knives are out of place. And begins berating Emer for that. And Emer's like, well, I'll fix it. I'm sorry. And the mother's like, no, it's too late now. Go get your father. It's time for dinner. And so you're forced to go get your dad. And you walk into the den, and in the den, the dad's there, clearly watching 8-bit pornography. Like, Custer's Revenge is on their little computer TV screen thing. It's not exactly Custer's Revenge, but you can pretty much tell what's going on there. And you try and interact with the father, and he's saying these crazy things about birds and how silence is the language of God, and basically giving like this mini kind of creepy sermon to Emer. Then it transitions into a dinner scene, and both parents are berating Emer for, everything she does wrong and how she's ugly and, a wretched person because she set the table wrong and all this stuff. And she's eventually told to go to her room. And as she leaves, the mom and dad just start having a nice conversation about how wonderful and lovely the potatoes are, the spuds. And Emer gets back to her room and is taking all of these words that have been said to her and putting them out on her doll, insulting it and calling it names. And then you notice as she's talking, it kind of becomes, she ends by talking about how lovely the Babby is, and then just says spuds. And she's mimicking all the things her parents are saying and just putting it on the doll. And you can also kind of tell at the same time, just from how that scene is constructed, that she is almost jealous of the spuds for getting that kind of praise. And that's just so heartbreakingly sad. And the game isn't going to get much happier than that. So she goes to bed, and in the middle of the night, she's woken up by gunshots. These loud, punctuating shots that happen in silence. Again, sound effects. And you can run around the house. No one's anywhere. She goes into the master bedroom, and there she sees that her family has been shot. Mom's dead. Dog's dead. Dad's dead. And Dad's holding the rifle. And she goes to leave the room, and a neighbor comes in and takes her away. And then it transitions to weeks later, and she's back in her house, and this time she's all alone. Emer decides that she wants so badly for things to be back the way they were that she goes and digs up the bodies of her mom, dad, and dog and brings them home and is going to fix them. And this is the part of the game that really has the most game-like elements to it. And she's basically trying to program them back to being the way they were. And so you can kind of put different personalities into her family, and it's it's a 1-to-1. It's not like a huge array of options, but you can kind of experiment. And even if you get if you replace kind of these programmed personalities and you put them in just the right way to make it so that her family life is actually happy and her parents are expressing how much they love her, Emer is not satisfied with that. And so you have to actually put the correct personalities into the correct bodies where they are berating her and calling her all these names. And then that's successful. And then she's like, well, I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed now. Emer goes to bed. And then again, you hear the 2 gunshots. At that point, it kind of has a little coda to the game because that's pretty much the end. And Emer is just kind of in this black void, and her parents come up to her and basically apologize for being awful and being the way they were. And the dog comes out, and then at this point, her brother also comes, and it's not really revealed because it was kind of hinted at by the whole fact that he wasn't in the house previous to this, but her brother's been dead the entire time. The game explicitly makes that clear at the end here. Both the mom and dad are overjoyed to see their son again, and the dog is happy, and they're having kind of this family reunion type thing. And mom and dad turn to Emer and say, our family's whole again. And then everyone leaves Emer alone. and she walks off screen, and that's the end. And just kind of, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreakingly heart eviscerating. That's a better word for it. Because the entire game is basically summing up an abusive relationship, because Emer knows, like, even as a kid, she knows that this probably isn't this isn't a healthy thing going on. Being called nasty names, having these people be around her and abusing her isn't good. But at the same time, those are her parents. And even if she reconstructs these memories of, the perfect family, that's not going to be her family. That's not going to be what was real. That's kind of revealed. There's a line at the end. I'll quote. She says, "I'd have given anything to grow up miserable with you." Like, think about that. That's the love of a child right there. I'd have given anything to grow up miserable with you. Even though it's an 8-bit game, and even though the interaction is very sparse, you're basically just moving around and pressing the space button to interact with different objects and people. There's something, I think, really lifelike about Oíche Mhaith, and it's tackling subject matter that doesn't get tackled in video games all that often. If anything, it gets kind of glossed over or barely mentioned, as like in last week's episode, not last week's, but in our Final Fantasy IX episode, we briefly touch on the fact that Zidane talks about having been abused by his adoptive father and beaten by him. But it's never as explicit as I've seen in Oíche Mhaith. And maybe there's something about how abstract the 8-bit art style is that we can fill in the blanks, and we can make it more real for ourselves with our imagination than if it was a higher fidelity type art style, if that makes sense. And yeah, it's honestly beautiful in its design. It's not fun. I'll tell you that much. Oíche Mhaith is not fun. And I think that caused a lot of consternation for people who played it back in 2011 and in the years since, because there are a lot of people who their baseline definition for what a game is and can be requires that a game be fun. And for a game to be fun, I think a lot of people, that necessitates for a lot of people that there has to be a happy ending. Because that's how games work, right? That's how games work. You break into the castle and you rescue the princess and everything's great, right? And I think just over the years we've been seeing more and more games subvert that expectation and show people that games can actually be much different than that, can actually access a wide range of emotions and topics and tackle them in ways that are very, very powerful. And I think we're just barely scratching the surface of how participatory storytelling can really grab people by the heart. I think you see it, you're seeing it more in stuff like That Dragon Cancer, which is another great, beautiful game that will absolutely rip your heart apart. And this is kind of along those lines, except that there's not really... It doesn't leave you necessarily with a catharsis at all, which I think is largely what a lot of people who have played it and complain about it after the fact, I think that's really what they're complaining about. There's no sense of closure to it. the game just ends with this poor little girl all by herself, being left alone by her crazy abusive parents. And the game itself kind of recognizes that, and there's a line at the end during the coda where I think it's the dad says, maybe you're better off without us. And like, that might be a good point. Like, that might be kind of what this game is getting at. Maybe that's one of the questions I guess it brings up. Is it better to have abusive parents, or is it better to have no parents at all? That's just something that this game touches on and doesn't have an answer. It is a slice of life kind of game. But it touches on so much in so short a time frame that it's really, really impressive. Just as another example of something I hadn't noticed until I replayed it just 30 minutes ago. When they're talking about the spuds and how lovely the spuds are, they're making plans, the mom and dad are making plans to get more potatoes, more spuds, sometime in the future. And that does double duty because it transitions into almost like this flirting type thing going on between the mom and dad after Emer leaves. But B, it also creates the expectation that there's going to be some continuing narrative with the parents being alive. And the game immediately undercuts that with the family murder, I guess. And not only that, but because there's that flirting, they're talking about, how I bet you have strong arms for digging out spuds, and I bet you have nice hands for washing spuds. That sets up, there's a sexual undertone to this as well, because the mom is actually naked at the crime scene, as is, I believe, the father. There are games that deal with touchy subjects in ways that are kind of light, and then there are games that just let heavy subjects be heavy. Ikewa is one of those, and it just lets that weight sit on you. And it's the kind of game you're going to play it, and then you're not going to be able to forget it. I mean, you might forget the name just because most people don't speak Gaelic or Irish, but you're going to remember this game, and in 3 years after you play it, you're going to be like, well, what was that game I played again? It was the 8-bit game, it was Irish. I need to play that again, because that did something weird to me. It's stuck in my brain, and it's just important. I need to take another look at it. And I guess I just think that that's a really important kind of game. It's also important to see what you can do in the constraints of... under the constraints of technology. So, you can manage to pull a game like this off. You can pull off a game that is incredibly bleak and has something to say without needing all of the fancy toys. You don't need Unreal Engine 4. You don't need all that stuff. You don't need all of that. You don't need a 40-man development team just to make a game that speaks about something you feel is true and honest and makes people think. And I think one of the things that helps with Ikewa, even though it is one of those kind of arty games, artsy-fartsy kind of games, it's not so much so that it is far removed from what a lot of people are used to in terms of video game visuals or video game controls. Like, it's immediately recognizable as kind of one of those top-down RPG-ish looking things. And that accessibility really plays into how easy it is to kind of fall in with it and just kind of go with its flow. And it's really interesting. And I found some really fascinating discussions online about how this game toys with agency, because again, it came out in 2011, and a lot of games allow players to kind of try and game the system for the happiest outcome. One of the things I was reading compared it to a game called One Chance. If you haven't played that one, I might talk about that one on a future episode. But it came out, I think, roughly around the same time as Ikewa. In that game, there are ways you can kind of, the main premise is you're supposed to make a bunch of choices, but you only have one chance to make all those choices. You can't play it again to kind of get a better outcome. And there are ways, of course, of getting around that, but that kind of encapsulates a lot of people's approaches to video games. For example, I remember we were talking in our recent Mass Effect episode about how people play Mass Effect. And I was kind of surprised when Daniel mentioned that a bunch of people had died in his suicide mission at the end of Mass Effect 2. And he hadn't gone back to replay it. He had just let that be, and let that be the playthrough he was going to take to Mass Effect 3. And I think that is very uncommon for a lot of people who play video games. I think a lot of people go back and try and get the best outcome, because that is, I'm saying this in air quotes, winning. Ikewa is unique in the fact that you win in the sense that you complete the story. But there's no, again, this goes back to my point about catharsis. There's no sense of victory in that win. You just finished something. The same way you don't really win anything when you finish reading a book. You're just done with the book. Ikewa is in that category. And I think as we go forward with video games, we're going to see more and more games that are like this, that use the language of video games, but also do something different with them. Do something different with the medium, and that doesn't rely strictly on this idea that in order to be a game, you have to have a win condition and a lose condition, or some kind of sense of victory or accomplishment. Sometimes just finishing something is finishing something. It doesn't always necessarily have to be a victory. You didn't win watching that movie, you just watched the movie. And I think that's going to be, or the past, 6 years since this game came out, I think that's been a process that the entire game industry has been going through. And I think that can be traced back to a lot of people's underlying maybe resentment or the backlash against games like this, because it challenges the notion of what games can be. And I think that's ultimately something that's going to win out. We're going to see more games that are willing to be different and willing to break outside of what expectations of what games can be. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. That's good and healthy for the medium to change and grow. And I think Ikewa is a very powerful example of that. And it's one that I think everyone should play. I don't think... It's certainly not for everyone. And like I've been saying, not everyone is going to enjoy it. And frankly, very few people are probably going to be like, yeah, that was a fun time. really happier now that I played it, but I think it is a growing experience. Ikewa is a growing experience. And also probably not the kind of game you want to introduce like your 10-year-old to. You probably an M-rated 8-bit art game. We'll just put it at that. So yeah, by all means, check out Ikewa, and please forgive me if you actually understand Gaelic/Irish, because I can't say it right. And I also, after I started this show, I totally blanked on whether or not Irish and Gaelic are the same thing. So I apologize, and I hope you forgive me for that. And please go try Ikewa. All that being said, time for me to wrap up this episode. I'm gonna do that by just saying, hey, you there, listener. You know what you should do? You should head over to extra-life.org and sign up for Extra Life. What's Extra Life, you say? Well, it's this awesome charity where when you sign up, you can choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital you want to support. And then 100% of all the donations you get from friends, family, and strangers goes directly to that hospital to pay for sick and injured kids. It's really amazing. Nothing gets skimmed off the top. 100% of it goes directly to helping kids in hospitals pay their bills. And you raise that money by playing games. What? It's pretty sweet. So head over to extra-life.org to learn more or sign up. It's really amazing. You can also head over to the community.extra-life.org where you can find out more and interact with the community. You can even find this podcast, and you can find a bunch of other cool stuff. Working right now with a guest author from the community to write a piece that's actually defending Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. So you might see that pretty soon. It's pretty fantastic. I'm pretty excited about it. And yeah, you can also find us on Twitter at bestgamesperiod. We frequently do polls there to kind of see how people are feeling about the games we talk about that week, so that we can kind of validate or invalidate our own position on what belongs in video game canon. Next week, you'll be hearing an episode about Devil May Cry, which will be amazing. And you can also back us on Patreon. We have one of those, patreon.com/bestgamesperiod. We're just looking to kind of get a few extra bucks to cover our hosting expenses. So that's pretty much that. And yeah, you can find us on iTunes. Leave us a review. Give us some honest feedback. We always are looking to find new ways to improve the show or what you guys want to hear us talk about. So yeah. Thanks for listening to me talk for a very long time about a very obscure Flash game. I hope you all have a good week, and we'll see you on the flippity dippity.